Hey everybody, let's see if we're live here in a second. Right on. Okay, and we are live on YouTube at least. All right, if you're just joining us, this is our first episode of On the Fly. We have David Luecke in the studio remotely. Everybody's remotely. Stay safe, everybody. We're going to be getting to Feather's Batch. This is our first time doing this type of broadcast, so bear with us as we move through a couple of technical difficulties on day one. Live coding and live streaming, as it turns out, always have its nuances. Right on. David has been the core author for Feathers.js for the past 6 years and doing what we all love and do for the better part of the past couple of decades. Curtis is my co-host today, business partner here at Aquil.io. We write software for the web, and we've been using Feathers since its inception. We're big fans of it, and we like all things JavaScript. Today we're doing Feathers Batch, like we said. David, take it away.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for having me. I've been actually wanting to do this for a while because one of my favorite terms is, as a white man once said, nothing goes ever wrong if you live code something. Now, if people ever wondered who that was, that person sitting right over there, it's Alexis. So, so what I want to do today is basically just talk through writing a plugin, because just to share like what the experience is and then how it all comes together and what the ways are to test things, and maybe even how I work. You might see quite a bit of me doing typos on screen, so I apologize for that in advance. That's why I have two people that are helping me out and yelling at me when I'm making silly mistakes. So that's great. So the thing that I wanted to work on was Feathers Batch, which you can see here actually already exists as a module, but has not been updated in 3 years. What it does is basically, it's like a small plugin. Even this version was only 45 lines of code, like most Feathers plugins. And what it allows you to do is basically have an endpoint where you can send a batch of requests to different service calls in one. The reason why you would do this is, well, to just minimize your request load. So let's say we have like a React website or a Vue, doesn't matter, that loads like a whole bunch of different components that are all making different requests at the same time. There's no reason you couldn't just collect all of them and then send them to the batching service. So what I'd like to do today, and see how far we get in like an hour and a half, maybe two, is create the server-side service that does this. And then also hopefully do a client, because this old version only had the server-side part of it. So you always had to put together your own requests manually. So what I'd like to do is see if we can put together a client that collects all service requests automatically and makes a batch request under the hood, which will show us some neat internals and testing things, I hope. So collects all of that under the hood, so you can still use the Feathers client-side app the same way you usually would. So you just make your requests, and if some of them are made at the same time, it'll just be batched together. So that's what I'd like to do, and we'll see how all of this goes. Any questions, concerns, thoughts?
I think we're good. Let's jump into it.
Okay, I'm gonna hydrate, because important. All right, so what I did is I cloned the repo and basically deleted everything to start with something very basic. So how I start pretty much every plugin is with a hello world export. So for this, it's important we're not using any TypeScript, Jest, Webpack. There's a million different things. that maybe are useful in some cases, but not in this one. In this, we're going really down to the bare minimums, and only, as you should with any project, add things when we actually need them, not because somebody said it's the thing you need. So this is using plain Node version 12 and older, newer, sorry. And it's a pretty bare bones plugin too. So this is our index file. We're going to implement the code in this later, and this is our test that basically just tests that the output that we return from this function. So this is how I start. Oh, it imports it up here, as you can see. This is how I start pretty much every plugin. I think one thing interesting to look at is a couple of the package.json setups. A lot of it is pretty standard, but the interesting ones, I think, are the release scripts. So this is how we're able to just publish a new version with one command. This changelog generator is used for like plugins. Feathers itself uses conventional commits now, which is what I want to migrate every plugin to, but I'm not going to do that today. Here's our Mocha tests. We're just running all the tests in the test folder that we just looked at. And then coverage is always a good idea. There's this tool called NYC. There's a little configuration file up here that says how to create the report. All of this is going to be open source soon anyway. I'm going to push it, and then you can look at the specific files. I'm not going to go through that, but I wanted to show that if we run those tests now, so I'm going to have the test up here. If you run the test right now, it does some linting based on the standards that we're using, and then runs the test. I'm going to make this smaller because we don't need this right now. I hope everybody can see this, okay? Runs the test and also shows our code coverage, which is 100%, which is always a good idea. I mean, Curtis and Alexis know having tests is probably one of the most important things you can have as technical things in your project. And writing them from the beginning, you usually like get more than 90% code coverage. And for plugins that are used by a lot of people like this, or Feathers, I'm usually shooting for almost 100 by now, just to have the certainty that you know, if anybody contributes, they know if it's going to break or not. Also, if you contribute to open source, always write tests for any feature that you add. That is the most common request and the most common thing that we're not seeing when people are contributing. And it helps you to learn more about what you want to do there, and it helps us to make sure that nothing else is blowing up. Cool. So this is basically how every plugin starts. As I said, we want to create a service that can take a couple of method calls and turn them into submit them as one to the service. And the format we actually already have. So the format from how to pass a service call from the client is already, we have a format defined here, which is the Socket.io format, where you basically say find method name. So this is what Feathers is using internally. When you're not using the Feathers client, you can use the WebSocket socket or the REST API, of course, directly. And sockets have like this specific format that you need to send events with, or those requests that is specific to Feathers, but I'd say a good idea overall. So it looks like this. You have the method name first, then the service name, and then the query. For a find request, for say a create, it's the, again, method name, service name, and then the data. And the next item here would be the query if you want to pass one, but you don't have to. So this is kind of the format that I like to duplicate for the batching service, because we already have this defined, and it'll end up working the same way, hopefully. Cool. So as I said, this whole thing is a service. So we'll probably just start with our class. With the batch service, it's a Feather service. I'm quickly going to pull up the API for that, just to keep everybody in the loop. So right here. So we want to implement this create method where we're going to do our batch calls and call off to the other ones. So it's an async function. We have data and we have our params. Then we have a constructor. We might need some options. We'll figure out if we do later. And then we pass the app. And then the last one that we will need, and I put it in now so that I don't forget it, is the setup method. I'm going to explain why once we get there. Okay. So interesting tidbit here. I'm passing the app in the constructor. You could do this already in the setup method, but I ended up passing the app in constructor more often now because that makes it easier to test. So setup is only called when you actually start a Feather server or you call it yourself. The constructor is called as soon as you initialize it. So this is a pattern I found myself doing more and more, where I'm passing the app in the constructor just to make it easier to test. Okay, like some boilerplate and typos, as I warned you. And then, so if I'm looking back at the format for the old batch, it was basically you have a type, a series in parallel. This is because it was old and we're still using callbacks. We're only going to run our batch calls in parallel because they're not really dependent. So you can't really send dependent batch calls yet. That will be a much more complicated topic. We're just going to say we want to batch requests that can be done in parallel, that don't have anything to do with each other. And then you have a call array, which shows this. Now, I was thinking, because this is going to be a breaking change, we should probably change the naming a little as well. So this is where I need help, because naming things is difficult. I would say we're going to call it calls. So you're going to submit a calls thing that has an array of arrays, which are the method calls. Cool. Then we're going to go through each one, through each call, and actually pass it to the service that we want. There is an interesting tool called promise.allsettled that actually allows us to do that. So what we want to do is call everything in parallel, but then we want to wait for everything to finish. Now there is promise.all, which basically does that. And I'm quickly going to pull up the docs for this. Here. So this basically allows us, is there a good example somewhere? I'm not sure. To wait for a number of promises and then get their return values as an array. This is usually useful because if you have multiple and one of them fails, the whole thing is going to fail with that error. But if you want to do the batch requests, we kind of want to get back the things that failed and the things that were successful. And this is where this all settled comes in. I'll make this a little bigger. Which basically does the same thing, but then returns you a format like this. So it returns you for each promise that was in the array, the status, if it was fulfilled or rejected, and pardon me, the value the result return value, or the reason, which is the error. So this is pretty useful for when you want to wait for a lot of requests that all work. So we can say settled promises await promise.all settled, and then see typos. And then we just say we'll map over the calls with an async function payload. Call the array in the array. So let's quickly look back here. So we have the calls are an array, and then each method call is like another array of our arguments. There. And then the format is basically we have something like this: messages, and then, or we have something like create messages, text, and then query. Yeah. So we kind of got to do some ES6 magic here, which I always love. We'll take the first argument of the payload is the method name. The second is the service name, and the rest is the arguments. Now we need something in here that's kind of important, because this query parameter is, so for a service call, this would be usually would be params, right? So when we actually call the service method, we want this to be the params and not the query. So I have to kind of like put something here that tells me where the params are. So for find, params are at the first spot. I have this still open. There we go. So for find, params is the first argument. For get, it's the second. And for update and patch, it's the third. So I'm going to store this here so that I actually can replace them. So this is number 2, and patch is number 2, and the default is number 1. So this is interesting because we need this right here to make our actual arguments. Argument list. Oh, params. That's what we need first. So the params for the service call, like I said, is these original params merged. So this creates a copy. Very important. ES6 magic. I always like it. Merged with the query, and the query is the argument at the position for the params. So params position of the method. So we'll have, if it's find, we'll get 0. Hold on. Let's do this. Find get is 1, remove is 1, and create is 1. There you go. So this is our original query. If it's not passed, we'll just make it an empty array. Cool. And then I should probably put another bracket in there. And then I have to actually name this differently. So we're going to say service params. All this is just ESLint complaining, or TS, like linter complaining that I haven't used it yet, which makes sense. Cool. Now we're going to get the service. So we're going to say, is this so that service that we have up there? Let's rename this to service name. I found that a lot of my time is actually spent renaming stuff, making sure that it's named properly. So this is the service. Now we just say, okay, we'll do error handling here in a second. I should probably install our errors so that I can throw the right one. Pull it in here. We want a not found down here. So if there is no service, we can't do anything. So new not found service name not found. So because this is an async function here, it will just become another result in our settled promises, which is kind of neat. Okay, sometimes it's a little too strict about all this stuff. Okay, now if you have a service, let's do this. Service of methods. So if this is not a function, we want to throw invalid service. Let's make it more generic. Yeah, we can throw a separate error later, but at least we catch both cases when we try to call something that doesn't exist or a method that doesn't exist. Service of method, and this is where we actually call. So we say const result await service of method, and then we got to update our arguments. So the final arguments, so this is going to return a new array. These are our new params that we want to call the service with. This is the parameter position. So I'm going to pull this out, get to a separate variable. This is the parameter position. This is the actual params. This is the arguments. So now we want to replace it before we actually call it. So I can actually say, because this is a new array, usually it's not a great idea to mutate an array that you're passing around or any kind of object. But in this case, it kind of makes sense because this is only in this scope. So it's okay. So we can say the argument at that position will be replaced with the service params.
Hey, David, we got a question from the audience here,
yes,
too.
Please.
Also, you got a typo, just in case that comes up on line 38. That's result. A question from Bo Shaw. What is the value of an array of strings versus an array of objects, such as an array of method as a property, create data as a second property?
Can you clarify a little bit? So the value of these arguments here, right, is, I'm hoping that is the question. If you go back into our Aquil.io client, it's everything that comes after this and this. So it's, in this case, it will be this. So in this case, the ID and then the query. In what is the other case? In this case, it would just be data and then params with an empty query. Was that the right answer?
I guess we'll check in with Bo later in this episode.
I hope I answered that. So yeah, so these again, we have the method, service name, and then the arguments. And the kind of dance I'm doing here is replacing that argument that is the query from the client with the actual parameters for the service call. Again, this is actually a not uncommon question. It's like, why can I pass params like right here? And the answer is, well, params is like a server side, like only the query is passed between like a client and the server. So we want to simulate the same behavior for our batching mechanism. The reason why only the query is passed is because you have like important information in params like authentication or user object or SQLize includes or like a lot of things that definitely should not be passed by the client in any way. All right, so we have our result. Actually, I guess we can just return this right away and see what happens, because that will be our first kind of like prototype. So other tidbit here, if you return something that returns a promise, which every service method does, we don't need to do await, because it's like duplicate. So if you return a promise from an async function, it'll still be a promise. So now we have our list of settled promises from all the service calls that we pass to. We need to do a little bit of conversion here, because I can show you, if I do json.stringify of new error, hello world, I get an empty object. This is quite painful because you can't really serialize errors nicely. So we gotta, when we get a not feathers error, because feathers errors have a toJSON method that returns a nice error object for you. If we get something that is not a feathers error and just a normal error, then we have to convert that into something like with a message, like an object with a message. Exit. No. Well, never mind then, I just canceled it. Okay. So I can say settled promises map. All right, this is how I usually call stuff. If current.status, let's look at it again. I can close this. So rejected. That's what we want. So we're going to spread this again and then just say reason is message. That's kind of what I want. But what I actually want is the reason is either current.reason so if we have a toJSON function, we call that one. Which would be, if it's a feathers error, it would return all the feathers error things that we will in the client return, convert back. Otherwise, we're going to say message reason.message. So this is a nice. Oh yeah. I'm debating if we can make this more clear, because we have like the current reason and the reason. So you get like, let's call it converted error. So reason toJSON function, call that, otherwise return the message. And then we can say the reason is the converted error. Otherwise, we don't really need to do anything. So if it's a successful one, then that's fine. Cool. One thing right here, before I forget, I'm going to build this into the plugin. Basically, we don't want event of the batching service to be published, because that doesn't really make sense, and it's like clients shouldn't be able to see this. So what we can do during setup, because this is when the server actually gets started, we can say, okay, if I can type, so if you set up Aquil.io, the service has a publish function where you can return the channels that you want the events to go to. And what we're doing here during setup is basically say, never return anything. The authentication service does the same thing. So whenever anybody authenticates, you will never get an event because this is the most specific one. So no events from the service ever anywhere. Cool. That was important because I didn't want to forget. Yeah, so this is V0 of our batch service. And what I often do is like have like a wrapper function. So we could, maybe we don't even need this one this time around. Let's try it this way. So we have our batch service, and now we have to write tests and see if all this stuff actually even works. So we're going to import our batch service, and then the best way to like write tests like that is to create like a pretty minimalist feathers app. There it is. Let's create a pretty minimalist feathers app, so we can say, okay, a dummy service that just returns. This is my pretty like go-to service whenever I start testing something. And then so this is our server app. Okay, and then we can use the batch service, which is basically you say like batch new batch service. Let's make this a little more structured. So we say app.use dummy. Okay. App.use batch new batch service with no options. And the app. I'm going to make that nicer. Eventually, we'll iterate. When I was studying, that was called extreme programming. Don't ask me why. Okay. Initialized the service. Let's start with that. Assert, okay, app.service batch. And then it makes a batch call. App.service, so this is how we use it, right? We say app.service batch.create, and then we have our calls. And the first one will say get dummy testing. Two, three, and then do this. And then, I mean, this is how I roll. We'll just console log it. So if we run our tests, we should get something coming out of there, or an error, which is more likely. But then we'll go and fix the error. Drum roll. No errors, because apparently I didn't make a mistake. So as you can see, it came back the way we wanted to, right? So we get our results. They're all fulfilled with what we've returned here, our ID. This is cool. I sometimes do the console logs because then I can just copy and paste the expected result if it actually is what I want. So then we can say assert deep strict equal results to this. And we'll run it again because then I can drink some water because it takes a bit. Actually, so in order to make this a little faster, I can just run Mocha itself, as we've seen earlier in the package.json. It's a lot faster. We don't get code coverage, but that's okay. Now I'm going to run it again one more time because we will see that our coverage is pretty terrible. And now, which makes sense, right? Because we only tested the happy path here. So you can see line 32, 42 to 46, 42 to 46. So our error conversion, none of this stuff ran. Our setup didn't run. Yeah, kind of all makes sense. So we now want to test the error case. Pretty easy to do. We just say like if ID error. So if I'm going to do a get call for an error, new. Let's do two different versions for errors. We want to do a feathers error. So now that I have to think of one, I can't think of one. Okay, here, errors. What do we have?
To everyone tuning in, this is a great example. Always, every day, Curtis, David, and I, we have doc pages open throughout. Right now we have the author of Feathers looking at the Feathers docs. There's no shame in it. You don't have to memorize everything.
That is absolutely correct. And sometimes I'm like, oh, that is actually in the docs, but this is what we're looking here for. I kind of just want to pick an error, and now I can't like pick two and it's like not, let's do this. All right, not acceptable. There. Okay.
I'm disappointed that there's no 413 there.
I know. I would accept pull requests for 413. I'm a teapot.
That's a Hacktoberfest request right there.
Yeah, but actually a good one. Okay. We can actually talk about that at the end of this. Okay, not acceptable. Throw new, not accept. No. And then we also say if ID error, we'll just throw a normal error because remember how we needed to like convert it. So this did not work. Okay, so now I'm going to create a new test case. What did I call the first one? Makes a batch call. Makes batch calls with errors. And then by the way, tests are one of the few places where copy and pasting is totally okay. I've seen like a lot of cases where somebody tried to be too clever about their testing setups, and it became so confusing that the test basically became useless. So make them as basic as you can. Like, you know, in this case, we basically just made an app and a service. Like this is as bare bones as we can get. We will make an integration test later, but we want to test the core functionality that we just implemented first. So copy and pasting, totally fine. But in this case, we actually want error here. And I think feathers error here. Now, I'm gonna do my great console log again, just to see what happens. And if it is what we're expecting, which is basically the error object is converted properly, we actually increased our code coverage quite a bit too. We can see that, okay, so we have rejected reason with the message. This didn't work. This one is fulfilled. This one is rejected with the full feathers error JSON. So I'm going to copy this. I wish this wouldn't show up if it's undefined, but that is a different story. If this works and people like it, then I can do some feathers core refactoring live streams too. Okay, so I'm gonna run this with Mocha now. So let's look. 32, 57, and 58 are still not covered. Oh yeah, we probably want to test this one as well. So this is cool. This is where code coverage helps, because you're like, oh, okay, this is an error case. I probably know it'll work, but it probably won't, because whenever I didn't write tests for an error case, there was like maybe a variable that was wrong or something. The error case actually broke. So I always recommend to test as much as possible. But yeah, let's quickly run Mocha and see that it all passes. Okay, cool. So let's add another test case where we basically say, we can add this here because that's an error case too, right? We say like get foobar 1. And then, so we had like 2 cases that we're covering there, right? One is the service doesn't exist, and the second is the method doesn't exist. So we say like blah, blah. Dummy. Okay. So I think if I just run this now, I should get the diff and then can copy and paste it in. Yeah. Okay. So this is becoming quite a bit of code to test here, but we wanna test it all, right? Okay. Copy and paste. I might still compress this a little bit for the amount of room that it needs, but yeah, it's okay. This is my OCD. Yeah, so if you Mocha this again, we should see that everything is passing, and if we do it with code coverage, we should see that we should be more in the green now. Yeah, so 91% of lines, still not great, because our whole plugin is only 50 lines of code, and 4 of them aren't covered. So that's almost 10%. But we will do that later. There's one more thing. Now let's think a little about security. What can go wrong here? Well, we're merging the params. So if it's an external call, all other services are getting the same parameters. They're getting each call's query specifically. So that's cool. But what we're doing here is like service method, like we're just checking if the method is there, which is kind of okay, but not, because if the method is none of these, you could still call it, which is kind of not cool. And the best way to actually guard from that is if there is no param position, then we can throw an error too. So we can say if type of, if I'm so damaged by IE6. So this is what you do, right? Usually you get the param position from the method. If somebody tries to call a method that is not in this list, which is the feather service methods, then the value is going to be undefined. So you can do this. But I was almost about to do this because in IE6, it was possible to overwrite undefined with your own variable. This is how habits like drag through decades that are not even necessary, and it's really difficult to get rid of them sometimes. But this is definitely more clear. So we say like this is a bad request. Throw new bad request invalid method service name. Cool. We'll write tests for that shortly. But so now we can only call service methods, pardon me, the method that is being called gets all the params from the original call. So, any kind of protection you put in there is going to be triggered still. And this is basically our 50 line. Well, now it's 65, but it's a little verbose here. Batching service, which is basically the server-side piece and the new version of this old batch thing that we had before, using async await promise, like ES 2020, like promise all settled is fairly new. You can use it polyfill though in most browsers that support promises natively. So that's the server-side piece. It took us like 45 minutes. The client-side piece actually might a little bit trickier, but I'd still like to see if we can get it started and see what happens. So server-side piece is put together. It's cool. I am going to create a new file. Anybody have, while I'm setting all of this up, anybody have any ideas how we might go about this? So here's what I want to do. I want to make sure that you don't have to do these batch calls yourself. I want to be able to say like client.service messages.find, and then users get, like I want to be able to do this and still get the same thing back that I usually do. But internally have it been turned into a batch call if multiple are happening at once. Yeah, so I'm free to go set this up. If anybody has any thoughts, let me know. Otherwise, I'll copy and paste a little bit. Batch client. All right. Okay, this actually does need a little bit of thought. What I want to do, let's call this integration test because I want to actually make this a full integration test where we test the server and the client together. So this app is great. Actually, we can probably just use this one. What I do now is basically pull it out into a fixture exports.app equals app. We need the batch service up here. So I'm just doing this so that I can reuse it in the integration test. Okay, this looks correct. So we have exports.app, and then we just say const. This is the same as you would do with any with your normal Feathers app. If you did not know, you can reuse your app in like any kind of job or anything. Instead of having to call the API that's running, you can just import it and run things directly, much faster. I'm going to comment this out for a second and then make sure that our tests are still passing, because sometimes things blow up, which they did right now, although I'm not sure why. Makes batch calls with errors.
Side discussion here, David, coming in from the community, from Beauchamp.
Sweet.
He was actually wondering if we were going to add some sort of whitelist to protect or essentially lock down users from getting to the underscored methods. His comment was, it looks like we're moving in that direction.
Yeah, so we that's kind of what we did here, making sure that that this index list, this is only the allowed methods. So this is kind of what we added here, where we said like, okay, we can only call the official external interface, because you exactly don't want to be able to do that. So we can say like, okay, if the param position is undefined, which means that it's not one of these methods, then we'll just throw an error. I'm going to try and write a test for that shortly. But yeah, very important, because otherwise you could just start calling random stuff like the underscore methods on your services. So definitely important to think about those things when having a plugin, because it deals a little bit more with internals. Yeah, I'm still confused what's happening here, but invalid method, blah, blah, and dummy. This sounds about right. Yeah, I don't know why this is correct. Interesting. I don't know what, see, this is when copy and pasting is bad. I learned my lesson. But yeah. I gotta update all the other stuff too. Bad request. Okay. There. Cool. Okay. It's working again.
I think that was because I don't think you ran your tests after you had that params position check.
True. Yeah.
So I think it's erroring sooner than it was before.
Now you're totally right. So yeah, thanks, Curtis. So Curtis caught it. We didn't run the tests after we did this change, which actually also means we don't need this section of this check anymore, because no, I will put it up here. That's what it is. Okay. So good catch, Curtis. And also that means we can put this up here. So if this is an invalid method, or I probably should move this up though then, or the method is not a function, then throw the invalid bad request error. And I think our test should still pass in this case. No? Oh. Now we're playing whack-a-mole, because now we basically changed it. We changed it so that it's going to throw a not found error on the service. Oh no, this is something else. Undo this for a second, because I wanted to actually move forward to the other one. So let's do debugging in a second. Please, somebody keep a mental note for this. I would like to move to the client though, just to get an idea of what we want to do here. So I want to create an app. So we're going to import our app. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add Express as well, because that's the best way to test this. So I'm going to say feathers.js Express. We'll do this. And then now we have a REST API. Oh, express.rest. Now we have a REST API. Cool. That actually means that we can now import it here. Set it up before. So up here, I kind of want to make sure that the service started. So we'll say await new promise resolve app.listen 3030 or 7865. Once listening, so once server is listening, we'll basically say like resolve this promise. That means our client is going to wait until the server is started, and then we'll need a client app, which we can initialize here as well. So we say const client equals feathers, and then we'll do the client-side setup. So you just say const rest client. And then I also installed Axios, which is always a good thing to use with Node. So client.configure rest client. And then the port that we're listening on. And then Axios. So this means we're now talking to our Feathers client through REST at this URL using Axios. And I mean, one test that we could do for an integration test here already does a batch call. Is to basically say, I go client.service batch create calls, and then we have a dummy. So now we have our API server up and running, and we should be able to, our great surprise, see an error. Oh yeah, because I did not initialize it. I thought I was missing something. So look at our fixture. We say like, oh yeah, we definitely need to parse bodies or JSON bodies. Okay, so now I obviously clearly also copied and pasted the wrong one. No, this should be the right one, is it? Oh, no, wrong way. See, this is why we need a client-side plugin, because it's really easy to actually screw up the order. The client will make this a lot easier. All right. And then we'll just do this. Now there's a problem here that the server is actually not closing, which is frustrating sometimes. But the easiest way to do this for now is to tell it to just exit. Okay, let's run it again. Okay, now we have our client set up. We have a batch call. I can remove this. And then we can look at our client. So I'll see how long this is going to take and if it's going to work, because this is going to be the trickier part. What I want to do is a function with options that we can basically say like client.configure batcher. And then we also want in here a hook that kind of looks at, as a before hook, that looks at the current call. So we want to do something like, let's do this before collect batches. right? So I'm gonna create a collect batches hook function. This is async context. And in that hook, this is happening for every method. So we need, come on. I'll put this in here for now. I apologize if this is going to be a little chaotic, but we can talk it through and hopefully make some sense out of this. This hook, I want to say we have let batch calls is an array. Cool. Then I want to say batch const arguments or payload. We call it payload in the server. Is let's do some destructuring. We need the method. We need the service name, which is called path. So get the docs. Context of path. So this is the service name that we want here. And then we want the arguments, I think. Oh, it's not documented. See, and sometimes I realize that things are not documented. But we can look at how this looks in a second. So this gives you the additional arguments. And this is not actually what we want. Circle back. Okay, so we have the method, the path. Then we need args. That's an array. And then we need to put them together in a way that if method params. So we always have a query. This is always in there. If we have a create method, let's start with that. Then we also need to add the data. If we have get or remove, we push the ID. So that's the first argument for get and remove. If it's create, the first argument is data. Oh, this also applies to like patch and update. I'm gonna make this pretty, but this is how we roll for now. First ID, and then if the method is patch or update, we'll push data. So there's actually code that exists for this already, but I just wanted to like see how clunky this is, which it is. Okay, so we have, this is kind of our arguments. So our payload is method, path, and then the arguments. And then we can say like batch calls dot push. Almost. Now, that means we collected a batch call, but that didn't mean we waited for it. So if you, I need another dot. So if you think about how this works, in a before hook, we can set context.result to the result, which will skip the actual service call. And if we are on a client, it will skip the actual server call. So we kind of need to do something here with setting like context.result to something, the result of our batch call. The way to do this is going to be sneaky. Sorry, I didn't mean to clonk. It's going to be sneaky. We say new promise, and it has a resolve and a reject. So those resolve and reject are functions that we can call later. So we say, okay, pass this function along. So this is the batch promise. And then we can say await batch promise. Return context. So what we're going to do here, don't need this, is sneaky, but kind of fun. And this is how I've done like kind of batching mechanisms a couple of times now, is collect the payload, then push those references to those promise methods to let whoever is handling the batch resolving deal with. And if you look at how we implemented this here, basically once we get the batch call back, right, we just look at the status and then either resolve with the value or reject with the reason. So that's the idea behind it. Now, let's see how we can clean this up, and also how we can make sure that only a certain number of batches at the time will be executed. The secret there is timeouts. So we create a batch manager that says add batch call, constructor, a timeout, and then we can decide on how we're going to handle the timeouts and everything. But then you basically have a flush method, or whatever you want to call it, that actually makes the request. So here, let's call it app, this dot app, and then yeah. So down here we can basically just say this dot app dot service batch create calls this dot batches. And then before that, I'm going to reset this already, so that if somebody else makes new requests while this is happening, it'll be collecting as a new batch. This needs to be async. So now we have our results, and then dot map. So remember how we down here established that our payload is basically an object with resolve, reject, and payload. And we're going to do this up here and say this dot match batches dot map payload. So this will submit like just the payload, because we don't need to resolve or reject. All right, cool. And up here, I'm going to just keep in reference, because we're resetting the array here. So we basically can say like, okay, old batches. Well, current batches is more accurate. And then we'll go over the current batches. And we can say, okay, we'll need the batch value and the index. And then you can say, okay, the method call result, batch results from index. And then we can say if call result status fulfilled. I always wonder what, oh, with one L. You can see that English is not my first language. If it's fulfilled, then we can just say batch.resolve, which is the resolve from the promise down here, remember? Call result dot value. If I guess the alternative is it didn't work, so we just say batch. Call result dot reason. Now this almost might work, but it does not, because it's a JSON value of an error, and we actually want an actual error. So we have a nice tool in the Feathers errors that lets you convert the JSON value of an error you got from the client. So I just want to say, like, okay, convert the reason into a normal Feathers error. So you always get like the same errors on the client still. All right, so let's go through this again, talking through for myself too. We look at our current batch, reset it to an empty array so that if it happens again, we'll start a new one. Then we'll call our batch service with the payload of each batch call. And once they come back, we go through all of them, get the result, and then either resolve or reject the promise that we set in our hook. Now, this add batch call is basically just a but the other thing that we need to do here is initialize a timeout. So there's a couple of options we can do here. One is wait a couple milliseconds for each batch to like collect, or wait just to the next tick or something like that. But it's pretty common to wait like a couple milliseconds. Say like, okay, whatever is happening within 50 milliseconds is going to be added to the batch. So I'm going to say this dot timeout, set timeout, and then so if there is no timeout, create a new one. After, let's say, hard code this for now. We're going to turn this into options later. Where we just call this flush method that we just implemented. Okay, so if there's no timeout, create a new one. After 50 milliseconds, just flush the whole thing. And then down here, we basically have to also say this timeout equals no. So basically resetting the timeout. Another thing we could do is every time, like reset the timeout every time a new batch is added. So basically if you have like a request and 45 milliseconds after a new one comes in, it resets it, which is a different strategy. But let's work with this one because I have a feeling this might be a little easier. Okay, so we add the batch call, we push it into a batch, set the timeout if there's none. And when it's done, we'll just go and flush it all out. Cool. So that means down here, we can say manager equals new batch manager. And we're just going to use one globally right now. This we'll clean up in a second. So this is our payload. And then we can say like manager.add batch, call payload. Oh, I still need my promise. There we go. Like this. Okay, so we have our payload. This is our batch promise that we resolve, reject payload, we wait for, set the result, and then return the context. Whew. Any questions? Everybody confused now? Took me a while to get there too, even though I've done this a couple of times. No?
It's clear to me. It's just gonna be fun to test it.
Yeah, I know, right? So, as Curtis said, this is going to be a good time to try and test this. So I wanted to say like, this is a configure function. So I'm going to say like, okay, we'll get the app here. We have our batch manager. We collect our batches. We also have to do something here. If path, if we use it as an application hook, we should not collect our own batches because that would not be good. So the batch service, of course, isn't part of the family of batches. Okay, so this might actually be it already. We tested that it does a batch call. Now the question, if it okay, call this, I call the method batch client. So we gotta pull this one in from the client file and then say, okay, client configure the rest client, and then client.configure batch client. There's no options right now. All right, so it collects batches of multiple calls. Okay, moment of truth. We're an hour and a half in, so I'm actually making better time than I thought, but now it's the fun part of debugging this stuff. All right, so await client.service dummy.get test1. So here's the thing that I wanted to point out, that the batching is not going to work if you do it this way. The reason is that the batch, like the timeout will be a part of this awaiting. So the trick, and this is probably important for all of your client-side projects, I've had this in projects that I've used, is to use promise.all for making multiple calls. The reason is that those are happening simultaneously instead of one after the other. And for some external requests to take a little bit longer, like let's say each one of these takes like a second, right? This thing here would take 3 seconds versus this one would still just take 1 second. So it can make a huge difference in your app performance, client side or server side. Test 1, test 2, test 3, and then ES6 destructuring is like a good way to get the actual values. I'm just going to use the whole. I'm just going to log the whole array for now because I'm not too confident about my. Let's make this small. Okay, so we did configure the batch client here. We have our batch manager here, and then down here we have the batch. I'm going to export this too. Oh, never mind. This is why we want ES modules, but because we're still want to like do like older versions and don't have any transpilers or anything, we'll need to go old school for now. So manager, we collect our batches, make our promise that will be resolved after a certain timeout, and then we make an application-wide hook that says just collect them all. And then in our integration test, we configure it and then we'll run it. Now here's a trick with Mocha. If you only want to run an individual test, just use start only. And then something will happen, probably an error. Okay. Oh. Oh, this is my common pattern for configure functions. Like you would pass some options up here and then return a function that takes the app. That was the mistake in the error I had down there, because here I'm calling it as a function, which should return a function. So this is like the common way of using a Feathers plugin, right? So you configure it and then just call it with some options. Okay, now, next error. Cannot read property service of undefined. Oh, yes, because I did not pass it. So clearly I have to pass the app here. Did we pass options too? No. Okay. Next error. Oh shit, it worked. Oh, sorry for the swearing. I did not expect that to have to work. Okay, so let's figure out if this actually worked or if we just broke something else. So this is actually a tip I have for testing integration tests for Feathers, which I thought is like I do myself, and it's pretty good. You remember how we started the server on the app here, and we have a reference to the app? We can actually use events on the app, because this is not, you can't use the batch events through the client, but you can still listen to events on the app, even though you're making client-side requests. So what I mean with that is basically, like I'm using it often for being like, if somebody signs up, did the sign up email get sent out? So I sign up through the client and then wait for the email event on the server app to happen, and then just verify that it's the right one. So what we can do here is batch promise. We'll make a new promise because we want to listen to an event, resolve. And then I say server-side app, service, the batch service, once, created, data, and then resolve date. So this means we should get one batch event, which is to create. So this is still happening. Remember how we implemented this on the server here, the create method. Okay, this is the batch promise. These are our results. Let's just log batch promise. So now, basically, well, let's just still log the results. So this should resolve when this batch service is called once with the result of this batch call. So console log, okay, let's see. Drum roll, nothing. well, that is interesting because it shouldn't really be possible. Once created, there we go. But this is not what we were looking for yet, right? So is it making separate requests for each one? Well, we can like actually debug this pretty easy by just listening to all the events. So it looks like it's creating a new batch for each one. So there's still a bug there somewhere because, oh, maybe there isn't. I just remembered something. I think I might have made a little mistake here. Okay, so this is a Feathers internal that even I forgot about. Remember how we're going through all the settled promises here? It's an array, and if you return an array, Feathers will automatically turn it into a into like each array entry as an individual entry. So this is actually not necessarily wrong, but we can do this with a one-time hook service. So let's do it with a hook, a batch after create. So we returned this into an array. So this is not ideal, but let's try and do this with a hook and see what the actual result is in this promise. Oops. And it looks right. Cool. So this actually worked the way we expected it to. We can say like, okay, as a deep strip. Okay. So the results is basically an array with ID ID test2, ID test3, and the batch promise that we hacked up there together is assert deep strict equal batch promise to this. Okay. Now, the only other thing we want to test here, and two other things. So if we go and test everything with coverage, we shall see where we are lacking, which is, for example, the error handling, right? So that's one of the things we want to test. But overall, like 91% of our statements, the only problem is that in the client, our error handling isn't tested properly. And then remember, I wanted to get back to this part where I'm saying like, oh, like publish, the publisher. So this we can actually test by adding Socket.io to our fixture. We can do that by just come on, terminal. Give me back my terminal. I'm going to install Aquil.io in development, and then just add it to the app, because we just need to configure it down here, and then it'll automatically like have a publisher. If you don't configure real-time transfer, then your services don't have a publish function. And then the other thing that we wanted to the other thing that we wanted to test is the error case, which is cool. We can do that. We can basically say it collects batches with errors. And then what did we have again? So we have, this is going to be interesting. So we need promise.all settled here as well, because promise.all will like just bomb on the first error and never like actually return anything. It'll just throw the error. So we don't even know if the other calls were successful or not. So I'm going to go and use promise.all settled here as well, which means we might kind of almost getting back to same. Well, let's do a single one first, single batch with error. So I'll say await client.service dummy dot get, and then we had feathers error. So there is a Mocha hasn't, or assert hasn't, assert rejects, but this has like, I found it had like some really, so that basically makes sure that the statement throws. I found it had some really weird edge cases where it didn't work, which was really frustrating. So my habit is now to always wrap everything in a try catch block and then just say like, should never get here. And then catch the error and log it, and then okay, we have that installed. So let's run the tests again, because now we should also have our line 62 that was still not covered in the server. How much more time do we have, my friends? Do we have like 20 more minutes, or was it an hour and a half kind of thing?
We advertise an hour and a half, but we own the YouTube channel, and so it's as long as the internet will accept us.
That is fair. Okay, then I'm gonna like cap it at like 2 hours though, I think, because we got pretty far in an hour and a half. All right, so I didn't use the right error message, but I think we should now see the feathers not found error. Yeah, so you get a 406 not acceptable feathers error with the error message. So if you do error.toJSON, because it will get converted to a feathers error already, you can like do pretty good error handling and everything. So let's try this. npm run mocha. Yeah, cool. So this is exactly what we want, right? We're getting the same error object back too, which I thought was always pretty cool. Like this is one of the advantages of using feathers on the client. So we'll just make sure that this is a thing. Cool. And then we'll say actually, let me make a new one. just going to remove the dot only, and then we'll make sure that we also get a resolved promise and a rejected promise if you have like a batch request with two. So does resolve and reject from a batch. And then results, promise. Yeah, exactly. VS Code. Okay, so we have let's just do, to cover a little bit more. So this should give us the value of testing in the first one and the converted feathers error in the second one, which is correct. I don't know how I can deep strip equal this, but let's just do this. Hazard results 0 dot value, and then I'm gonna just lock the JSON because we know we got the right one here. No. Where is my typo? Right there. Ooh, it didn't work. Didn't. What's the actual error here then? Weird. This looks like a feathers error. I don't know why it didn't get converted, but okay. Doesn't matter. I'm just gonna test this. I think it's because it is like we're throwing a general error there, right? So we're getting back a general error. So I'm just gonna like compare the message. And that should work. Okay, and then we're gonna just run our overall integration and everything tests together. And yeah, I'm only 15 minutes over time, but I think that's, if it passes, it's a good wrap. So, maybe
right on.
See what we can do here at 9:55 to 56. 1 second. Oh, this is because of this ugly thing. I'm going to fix this in the final version. This is going to be nicer because there is actual tool utilities to convert the context into arguments and the other way around. But I think besides that, 95% code coverage, could do a little bit more on the branches here, but we did what we set out to do, I believe. We have a batching client and server.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, David, real quick on code coverage, what are your thoughts on being dogmatic about code coverage statistics in open source development versus actual, like, let's say, in-house internal projects or consumer facing products?
This is a really good question. So the reason why I was so adamant about this here is because I know from the experience of doing open source for like more than a dozen years that whenever you don't write tests for something, it'll break eventually. The more people use it, the more likely it'll break, which is why as high code coverage and sometimes even 100% is a goal. I think Mikhail is doing the same thing. And he even set it up so that when the pull request comes in and it still has 100% code coverage and passes, the module will get auto-published. So you're making your life for open source developers and contributors a lot easier by having a high code coverage, because then you can almost blanket accept pull requests because you know everything is still going to work as expected. For in-house, I think the most important thing is to have tests. And if you write even just a basic test suite, like we've done this for front-end projects before, right? Together when we work together, and writing a basic test suite that just clicks around your application sometimes gets you into the 80% range already. And you will notice that the things that break for customers often, especially in front end, are the ones that are not covered by those tests. So I wouldn't say go for 100%. Definitely don't be dogmatic. You got to be pragmatic. But the best way to make sure that testing doesn't become a huge pain is to write tests from the beginning, or from as early the beginning as you possibly can, because the longer you wait, it's going to become exponentially more work to cover all your bases.
Agreed.
Does it answer your question?
No, I agree with that completely. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
Any of your code that doesn't have tests is already legacy code, so make sure it doesn't happen.
Yeah, we did empirical analysis a while ago that all the projects, that was the biggest technical reason. It wasn't what framework you used or what language. If you didn't have automated tests, I mean, there was bigger reasons from the management side, but the technical one, number one reason was no tests. And personally, I highly recommend to go as minimalist as possible. So here I just use Mocha, it's a tiny library, and assert, which comes with Node, which is how I usually write all my tests. I find Jest, like for server-side stuff, a little bit overblown. I understand it's quite helpful for client-side testing, but you don't need it for server-side tests, in my opinion. But I mean, whatever everybody is comfortable with. So as long as everybody's just agreeing on the same testing library, that's more important than what testing library you're using.
So while we're talking about like consistency and things like that, like the nitty gritty of some of these, are you using an auto formatter like Prettier or anything while you're developing? I don't think you were.
We use I have this like semi-standard, which is basically standard with semicolons. And I'm not going to go into that discussion, but basically you can see that if you run the test now, it'll auto fix like a couple of those issues. And that's the one that's used all over Feathers. So you don't really have to worry that many. You saw it inserted the semicolon here. So it'll fix like indentation and all of those things for you without any configuration. Just same, I think almost same answer as before, right? If everybody agrees on the standard and it's enforced through a linter, that's what's important. Not if you use semicolons, not. As long as everybody does it and doesn't waste time arguing over it.
That's why I like using Prettier on some of my projects, because you just accept whatever the prevailing standard is, and it's like you're stuck with it. You can write however you want, but as soon as you save it, auto formats. So the fact that you like your braces on one line or another doesn't matter, because Prettier is going to clean it up for you, and then your pull requests are going to be much cleaner because everyone's got the same formatting going on.
Yeah, so this is the same. I think it's using ESLint under those, but I think Prettier is too, right? Just a different.
Yeah, I usually hook up ESLint with Prettier, and there's a couple packages that make everything kind of work together nicely, so they're not yelling at each other.
Yeah, I've seen that a couple times here. Like one thing, I don't know if you still have my screen on, Alexis, but you can. So instead of so the assert library got changed, that you used to be able to say deep equal, but that's deprecated because it didn't do strict equality. So you have to write deep strict equal. But you can also say, I want to import the strict section as the assert library. But then if I change this to deep equal, which is the deep strict equal, it still complains. So there's a little bit of pain there, but strict equality is a thing.
Right on. Did you want to talk about Hacktoberfest, David, while we're here, while we got you?
I don't know if people have been following like some of the maintainers that were saying that it is turning into more of a spam fest. So that was the only thing I wanted to bring up there. Doesn't seem to be a problem for Feathers. It's not cool enough, I guess. But you know, if you want to contribute to open source, I think I've talked about this before. The biggest challenge is not even like contributions, but repeat contributions is definitely you know, something that if you care about open source, you want, like, I'd recommend find a project that you get familiar with, and it doesn't have to be forever, but at least try and make more than one typo fix. Although typo fixes are fine, that's not the problem. But there is a big barrier between people that just use your code, people that file issues, people that submit little bug fixes, and then people that really dive into the code and see what problems need to be solved. And maybe the problem has been so far that a lot of things are working pretty well here, that you don't have to do that. But yeah, if you want to contribute to open source, contribute more than once to a project. I think that's my advice for this. The open source contributors will definitely appreciate it. And yes, if it's a very big contribution only once, that's fine too. But I think it's more about the commitment and the depth of the contribution and the value that it then brings to the project. Yeah, so one more thing I wanted to say for that is, like, I didn't curate anything for this year because I don't know, last year wasn't really, there was some issues that got fixed that were rather trivial, but it didn't exactly make that cut from typo fix to real contribution of functionality, code, tests, anything like that. So there's still, I think, work to be done there.
Spam that happened, which was unfortunate, but
right on. Well, I think that's it, David. Thank you. I mean, we had a good 2 hours here. Built a Feathers plugin from scratch. New version of a Feathers plugin, I should say. Release date. Help us out. Pitch the plugin.
I'm gonna see if I can clean this up and get it documented this weekend.
Bam.
And then we'll write an article and post the video as well, so that everybody can see how this all comes together from scratch.
Awesome. Sounds great. Apologies to whoever, if anybody was trying to watch this on Twitch, we had a bitrate issue, so we'll fix that for the next broadcast. But this video will be up on YouTube. David, thanks again for being here. Thanks to the co-host, Curtis. And I guess we will catch everybody on the next beat. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.